welcome to Novum. We're doing Loki season finale spoilers right from the get-go. There will also be spoilers for Rick and Morty, The Tomorrow War, and Black Widow, so you have been warned. And what a finale it was. I think the series as a whole has been really good, but for me the finale represented something extremely different, something that I could kind of feel coming from the closing shot of the last episode, that being a truly impeccable rendition of cosmic science fiction in comic books, and more importantly for this video, some distinctly unique and refreshing science fiction for the screen. And I think it achieves this firstly through good setup. It's had a whole series to build to this finale, but I think more so because it's bold enough to lean back on its themes and higher discussions, rather than rely on an oversaturation of action, as we would traditionally see in a superhero climax, or sort of vague abstract obfuscation, like we get at the end of Contact or Arrival, for example, or even the Matrix trilogy, where you provided philosophical or incomplete answers to the questions that you're really interested in. This is a finale that answers questions, a mysterious adversary that tries as hard as possible to demystify himself immediately despite his obvious power, to give the audience the answers and lore that they desire without removing his qualities that make him an unknowable threat. And I think this is something that writers out there should really take note of, because for me, and I'm sure some of you are the same, the confrontation with the villain is often more exciting than the fight itself. Especially in comic books, the grandstanding, the battle of ideals is just what really makes it for me. In Civil War, for example, the fight with Tony, Bucky and Cap is undeniably awesome, but as cool as it is, it's never going to get you like the moment before where they tried to make Tony see reason and he replies that he can't because he killed my mom. That's the climax right there. The fight after it is just for our visual gratification. And this episode is really 40 minutes of that. Loki and Sylvie forced to battle their demons, their motivations, everything they've experienced up until now, set against this insanely meaningful backdrop of who is going to control the timeline or cause the creation of the multiverse. Essentially the deposition of God himself in most meaningful senses. So I think just from that, it's pretty clear that they're onto a winner here. But seeing as I'm a massive sci-fi fan, I wanted to go through this episode with you guys and break down where and how they're separating themselves from the pack, as well as drawing some comparisons to other recent sci-fi and discussing the contrast there. If you loved the Loki finale, or if you just love sci-fi, I think you'll get a lot out of this. And if all of this sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing because I have a lot more cool stuff on the way. Okay, so in general, I think the MCU does just alright at science fiction. They're breaking even, at least. I love the vibrancy and the wackiness of the MCU cosmic efforts like Guardians of the Galaxy, although there does remain the persistent problem that humans, or visually identical humanoids, represent the majority of life in the universe. We see that at the TVA as well, incidentally. Every employee is human, but it's not really explained why this is the case. Obviously, we know it's a lot more expensive to make everyone an alien, but I feel like at this point it's becoming one of the MCU's elephants in the room. And I think the other major elephant is, or rather was, time travel. Because for everything the MCU gets right sci-fi wise, it also gets a lot of things wrong. For me, one of the most glaring was Tony Stark throwing together time travel just before bedtime. And also the sort of glaring plot holes left behind in Endgame because of time travel, which I have a video on if you want to check out. Luckily for us though, I think Loki has gone a long way to correcting the MCU's treatment of time and time travel, and the ending of this episode provides a really fun reset button to any issues they may have had, as well as providing opportunity for a future reset button way down the line with the inevitable recollapsing of the multiverse. While we're on the TVA, I love the Jack Kirby-esque landscape of this city or agency at the end of time. Kind of reminds me of Valerian in concept, and it's just so visually arresting. This is what we need to see more of in the Marvel cosmic arena for sure. In fact, the missing presence of all things Kirby and Jim Starlin's cosmic narrative was my overriding complaint about Infinity War. Despite the incredible film we did get, it was missing all the Shakespearean high drama regarding the fate of the universe and Thanos' strange extended family, the whole Infinity Castle on the edge of space that comprised this purposeful stage where this very theatrical drama played out. We got none of that, and maybe you couldn't fit that in the movie, maybe it didn't suit what the MCU was right then. But really, when I think about the Infinity Saga, that's the stuff I think about. There, Thanos doesn't have time or reason for invasions. He sits essentially as God at the edge of everything and casts judgment upon it. And what we focus on is the deliberation, the discussion of ideals and deeper meaning and consequence. That's why the eradication of half of all life is just a snap. The action of it isn't what's important to the story. And that, almost note for note, is what we get here in this episode. The castle at the edge of time and space, the godlike figure with the fate of the universe in the palm of his hands, the law and the conflict and the deliberation over ideals and fate and free will playing out in this Shakespearean closed room, this fixed stage. That's what I mean when I say it's bold enough to lean back on the driving themes here. It trusts you to be more interested in the meaning, the exploration and explanation, rather than the visual gratification. And that has to be at the core of good science fiction. Your desire to know the unknown and the writer's ability to deliver on it. It's much harder to give something like this room to breathe in a feature film. The longer format of Loki has been great for us getting a more complex story. If you look at the ending of Black Widow, we see something very similar in the idea that there is no final fight with the main villain. And in Black Widow, like many other things in that film, it didn't really work. It wasn't given room to breathe. The stakes weren't that meaningful. But here in Loki, it's quite the opposite. In fact, I'd say it elevates their efforts at science fiction by a pretty large magnitude. It perfectly captures the Stalin and Kirby-esque comic stories of Golden Age Marvel, while managing to be refreshing and unique enough to beat out all the purely original sci-fi that's come out this year. While these larger narratives about time in the multiverse and likely all of Kang's main arcs moving forward are built and chopped together from many different authors across many different comics, I think it's firstly amazing that we're getting to see these more fantastical narratives play out on screen, but I think it's also important to recognize that Loki, the show, is very much its own thing. And that thing, in my opinion, is extremely innovative sci-fi that carries seemingly quite extreme importance to the future events of the most successful film franchise of all time. While it may seem like par for the course in the MCU, this is a lot to do with the gravitas the show puts on its own ideas and the wider context afforded by the franchise as a whole. If we look at Rick and Morty for a moment, I don't think anyone can argue with the talent of the writers. In fact, Marvel asked Dan Harmon to jazz up their Doctor Strange script after initially feeling it wasn't weird enough. But the show itself is purposefully designed to make fun of tropes in science fiction, and so we often get this weird schism where the show is giving you something really cool, but making fun of itself for doing it in such a way that it's never quite satisfying or immersive in the same way it would be if it took itself seriously. Now, I love Rick and Morty, and I'm glad it is what it is, but in terms of the sci-fi we get out of it, it can be at points unfulfilling, because the cooler moments of sci-fi don't occur within a cohesive or meaningful universe. A great example of this is the episode with the narrative train. The train that the characters are on is an extended metaphor for the narrative of the episode, and narratives in general. And there are some insanely cool moments here, specifically the fight scene in the carriage where they enter different realities upon leaning out of the train. It's awesome as a concept, and not just that, the throwaway stories sound awesome in their own right. The show purposefully denies any kind of catharsis or meaning for comedic payoff, but it's undeniable there's a lot of awesome ideas floating around out there that feel cliche but haven't been given a quality or iconic treatment yet. And this one in particular, that the characters are made aware of their part in a narrative that we recognize is actually the episode, is one that writers don't traditionally knock out of the park, but it is something we see done very well in Loki. The difference here is that while Rick and Morty wants to lean on it for meta commentary, Loki treats it with respect and recognition, something that is destabilizing to our characters, while still maintaining that meta quality through the presentation of an actual script. And it's not just this, but also through Kang's desire to play out the scene. He is as aware of his role in this divine drama as we are. He even affects a theatrical English accent at points. All the meta commentary is shared between Kang and the audience. Loki and Sylvie are rightfully unnerved by the whole thing because, unlike Kang, they exist within the confines of their own universe. It's a very clever way of setting Kang up as a character who has this godlike, almost impossible level of knowledge. Just like Rick, he can see beyond the confines of his own show and recognizes the part he plays, and so we recognize him as being ultimately powerful. It's more fulfilling here though because there is no subversion for comedy. The stakes are far-reaching and certainly very meaningful. It's an idea that's been toyed with on screen by a fair few writers. The Architect in The Matrix is a great example, but here it's deployed so well that it's not jarring in any way to the narrative. The opposite, in fact, it provides both catharsis and further intrigue. The main criticism with this everything is written plot device is that it's kind of like time travel or resurrection, in the sense that it lowers or in a lot of cases just removes the stakes. Not here though, because in short order we're told Kang has fibbed, that he did know everything that was going to happen up until this point, but from here on out everything is a question mark. So rather than lowering the stakes, we're raising stakes we didn't even know we had. In one moment we find out that the timeline is protected and everything is occurring in stable order, being presided over essentially by a god, and then moments later we have this stability destroyed. Now everything is at risk. It's the moment the series has been building to. What happens at the end of time? And the answer is that we get our cake and eat it too, because the writing is really strong. We do come face to face with our grand architect, but as well as providing answers, it also provides chaos and uncertainty, conflict for the coming films and the Loki sequel, and free agency for our characters and the larger narrative. That's what happens when you give these ideas the credence and nuance they deserve and the room to breathe that they require to succeed. In my opinion, it's the main reason this series will continue to stand out in the MCU as time moves on, in a way that WandaVision, say, won't. Before we move on to some specific things done very well here, I want to discuss influences and plagiarism and the often quite blurry line in between. I recently saw The Tomorrow War, another example of science fiction in 2021, and on paper this should be a film I'd really enjoy. In practice though, it seems hell-bent on ripping off everything we as sci-fi fans hold dear. We've got The Thing, Alien, Edge of of Tomorrow, and the list goes on and on. Rather than paying homage, we simply have sections of other movies ripped out and inserted into something that feels entirely hollow. It doesn't understand the difference between homage or referencing and just stealing a part of a better film and jamming it in your own. I'm going to have to make a separate video about that actually because it's just so egregious. But it's also a stark comparison between that and the Loki finale. The MCU has become an ocean of callbacks and self-referentialism, able to not just draw on its extensive on-screen library, but also decades upon decades of comic book material. So it's unsurprising we see a lot of that in Loki. In many ways, that persistent referencing is what makes the MCU feel like a universe. But beyond the Thanos copters and crashed helicarriers, there is a wealth of referencing going on from things outside Marvel that is also worthwhile and really does add to the experience. I think perhaps the most apparent one here is Contact, mainly because the episode literally starts with it, and this is a great example of how to do an homage correctly. Just like in Contact, as the camera rewinds through space, we're given sound bites, famous quotes and radio clips, as the camera moves back through space and time, and we hear progressively time moving along with the quotes. It's great show don't tell, and it uses something we find recognizable from Contact to demonstrate what it wants us to know. That is, that we're witnessing the passage of time through space. But more importantly, it builds on it. We see one timeline from this perspective, and then with some very clever camera work, CGI and sound editing, we understand we're now switching to a competing timeline. There's even some visual nods to Interstellar and 2001: A Space Odyssey here. And then, most crucially, we understand what's going on when the camera finally breaks from this rushing momentum and moves out of the Space Odyssey-esque time stream to rest on Kang's castle. All the buildup of noise we've been fed suddenly cuts to an eerie silence, and we know we've moved out of time, so to speak. And all of this is communicated to the viewer without narration or graphic or subtitle. We understand where we are, how time works, and what's going on, which in this instance is not an easy thing to communicate. And all of it is achieved through visuals, sound bites, and an all-important homage to some sci-fi classics. This visual storytelling is equally important at the end of the episode, when our repeated shots of branching timelines, combined with this introduction, lets us know that what we're seeing here is the divergence or recreation of the multiverse. But the referencing doesn't end there by any means. We've got everything from Gothic literature to The Wizard of Oz to Beauty and the Beast, and assorted religious imagery, and even the Japanese design style of kintsugi, or the art of repair, which we see on Kang's tent pad and his castle walls, to provide visual illusion to the idea that he's pulled together the timeline from various parts, mixing and matching until he achieved balance. And let's go back to that religious imagery for a moment, because I've been seeing a lot of people on YouTube only going halfway with this. That is to say, most people seem to think there's this clear allusion to the devil. Kang refers to himself as the devil at one point, and as most people have already pointed out, he's eating an apple alluding to temptation, the garden, and original sin. But that's not entirely accurate. For a start, the snake in the Garden of Eden isn't really the devil. The devil doesn't really exist in the biblical sense, especially not in the Old Testament. The snake in the garden is actually representative of Lilith, the woman that came before Eve that refused to be subservient to Adam. The apple wasn't actually an apple, it was most likely a pomegranate. And as much as temptation and sin are connotations of the apple, and the devil has been retroactively applied to the snake, this isn't representing a turn towards evil necessarily. It's more Promethean than that. It represents knowledge man isn't supposed to have. Knowledge just like Kang has. Knowledge that Kang is offering to Loki and Sylvie. So yeah, it's a knowing nod to the idea of great knowledge being bestowed on man, but it doesn't necessarily denote Kang as evil. And that's important because however much setup they're doing to paint him as a devil or some grand figure of evil, they're doing the same amount of work trying to portray him as the opposite. They don't go as far as saying God as they do with the devil, but there are plenty more allusions. We've got the praying, the amen, the omnipotence, the references to his own dogma, the stained glass window behind him in a circular halo reminiscent of Christian artwork that we've seen recently in Promising Young Woman and seems to feature prominently in the upcoming Green Knight. Really, Kang, or rather Immortus as he is here, is a lot closer to ideas of a Christian god more so than the devil. But both illusions purposefully exist here. This duality is intentional. He's God in reality, both devil and savior, complicated and flawed because of his human origins. A cosmic god and a bored old man that doesn't have much care for morality or the individual lives of those residing beneath him. Most importantly though, not a creator. Creator of a timeline, sure, but not universal creator. Kang is a conqueror. He took this position through domination. Other than that though, he's absolutely the closest thing to a god the MCU has introduced thus far. And it's not limited to Christianity by any means. Kang also references reincarnation, which is a predominantly Hindu or Buddhist belief, but one that has had a lot of attention in sci-fi also through the idea of time being cyclical. And we see this confirmed visually. The timeline orbiting Kang's space castle is a circle. Really really, he's a conglomeration of a great many things, an idea of what a god may actually be should we ever find ourselves meeting one, and I think it's beautifully realized. And let's stay with Kang, because he's obviously the main draw of the episode. This guy is a sci-fi treasure trove. He's got a unique narrative, he presents a unique threat, and he presents the characters with a pretty unique gambit, deposition of the god figure, and the introduction of chaos on a multi-universal scale. This is all extremely important for a finale that is predominantly without physical conflict. I mentioned the architect already, and I think he is a great parallel to call upon here. They're both essentially gods, but gods of their own design. They're both figures you meet out of the blue right at the end that blurt out a lot of exposition and so on. And I like the architect, but there's also a lot of vagary to it that Kang doesn't suffer from. His exposition is very clear and meaningful and emotionally driven in a way that the architect's naturally wasn't. And while the Matrix trilogy did a good job of creating its own universe, it stands little to no chance of having the wider meaning we find ourselves applying to the MCU in the fallout of this episode. Even the gambit presented by the characters is similar, essentially continue or reset the universe. But I find these grand resets to be a bit of a narrative cop-out, even in things like Dark Souls, and Kang's alternative to that is a complete sidestep, the creation of a multiverse and the invitation of a conquering being of unimaginable power. It's not a step backwards, it's a step forwards. We get a meaningful shift going ahead, without any New 52 style resetting. Speaking of Kang's power levels, he also presents a far more significant threat than the architect. I think this is another genius thing happening here, because all of this is just setup. It's just introduction to the actual Kang by the more benevolent Immortus variant we see in this episode. And the MCU needs Kang to seem magnitudes more powerful than Thanos. That's why we see the Infinity Stones being used as paperweights by Kang's minions. We're setting up an even more imposing threat here. Kang even offers Loki the head of Thanos, while initially trying to manipulate him, and that really says it all. For Kang, the demise of Thanos is something he can clear up in an instant, with the click of his fingers. He literally controls time, and time is the weapon the Avengers have to use to ultimately defeat Thanos. And the other major building block to the threat is that Kang is terrified of himself, or at least deathly aware of the threat that he represents, or the other more bloodthirsty versions of him. He has some great lines about how he doesn't want to meet him, and the future he presents with the Kang set loose is a particularly bleak and violent one. I think it's safe to say when we meet Kang in upcoming properties, he's not going to feel as benign as this version.
Where's the mothership? It's coming.
And that brings us neatly to the final twist, where Loki is returned to the TVA and realizes that this isn't something he can prevent. Time is a circle, and Kang is already here and in power. There's also a further element to the Shakespearean or Greek tragedy with Sylvie's betrayal of Loki and her ushering in of chaos. It's all of this high drama with this beautiful sci-fi loop narrative that pushes the whole universe forward rather than simply putting it back where it began, that really separates this as amazing sci-fi. I can't speak highly enough of this episode in particular. I just thought it was great all round. One thing I hadn't mentioned, but I love the absurdity of it all, there needs to be an element of Kafka in cosmic sci-fi, and the Gothic castle on a floating rock in the middle of time, attended by a glowing clock hologram, is just the right tone. Alright, that's everything for this video. I'll catch you in the next one, guys. Peace.